Good morning, Lakeside. Well, I've heard of arias and ballads and campfire songs and Christmas carols and dirges, drinking songs, hits, hymns, instrumentals, jingles, lullabies, love songs, madrigals, rounds, show tunes, sing-alongs, spirituals, three-chord songs, 12-bar blues, and vocal music. But what in the world is a song of Moses? Well, there's three possible answers, biblically speaking. There's the Song of Moses, that is the psalm, known as Psalm 90, in which he talks about the brevity of life and prays that the work of our hands would be established. There's a Song of Moses mentioned in Revelation 15, actually, that the Song of Moses is sung in heaven together with the Song of the Lamb. That's interesting. But then here in Deuteronomy, Chapter 32, we have the Song of Moses as well. Now, are all those the one and the same song? I don't know. I don't think so. But we're going to study the Song of Moses, or maybe one of the songs of Moses, the one that's preserved here in the book of Deuteronomy. And the way I want to talk about this is just in terms of the great tension that this song creates and then resolves. So one of our key words is tension, because of the way it deals with its subject matter. It creates these theses, antitheses. So we have these pairings of thesis and antithesis that create all kinds of tension. We have finally, in the end, however, we have a resolution of everything, a grand synthesis that makes that tension finally go away. All in all, the song is teaching us that obedience in response to God's love is the key to being right with God. That if we would just obey in the first place, this tension would go away, because in the end, that's what God accomplishes. He gets people finally to obey in the end. But let's look then at these theses, antitheses, or point counterpoints, or if you think of it as a pendulum, where the pendulum swings all the way to one side, well, what is it like on the other side of the pendulum swing? And the first set then is wet versus dry. Wet versus dry. And I don't know how else to express it, but that's how the song begins. But just before that, we see in the last verse of chapter 31 says, "Then Moses spoke the words of the song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly of Israel." So Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who came up with chapter and verse divisions, he puts that little bit in the previous chapter. I'm not sure why he did that, but the rest of the song appears in chapter 32. And here's where we see the wet and dry. It says, "Give ear, O heavens, give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God." We in Nebraska, even with the Ogallala Aquifer, we understand the value of rain, that rain gives life. And here it's giving life, it's giving wisdom. This rain and this dew and this moisture is, as it were, falling from heaven. It's just what the earth needs. It's just what us earthlings need. And you probably know this, but we are about 60% water. As we walk around, we're actually like this big thing of water that walks around. How important water is to life, absolutely vital. And so Moses says, let me rain on you a little bit here with some wisdom, but also this is life for you. This is going to give you life the way water does. And then he hits us with a second set of polar opposites, if you will, and it's going to be good versus evil. Now, it's no surprise that God is the author of the good and man is the author of the evil. So here's the good side. Verse 4, "The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. a God of faithfulness without iniquity. There's nothing evil in God. Just and upright is he. Wow. Well, that's the pendulum all the way over here, where God is so good, it's hard to even describe how good he is. But what would we compare then if we were to ask for what's the opposite of God? Well, look at what man's response is to God's goodness. They have dealt corruptly with him. They, meaning mankind. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. What a great contrast. What tension is built here. Look at how good God has been, and look how evil man has been in response. God, by creating us, was engaging in a great experiment. I mean, he created beings who could choose. And while he didn't create evil, he created beings who could choose evil. And look at the evil that we have chosen. All right, the song goes on to create another set of thesis, antithesis, and that is God's generosity. Having trouble spelling here. Generosity versus man's ingratitude. God's generosity versus man's ingratitude. Verses 6 and following. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field, and he suckled him with honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock. Curds from the herd and milk from the flock, with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan, and goats, with the very finest of the wheat, and you drank foaming wine made from the blood of the grape. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleeked. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. I want to stop reading there. So God's generosity then is met with ingratitude. The more God gives his people, the more ungrateful they become. You know, this was impressed upon us who traveled to Nicaragua some years back, that we were going to a poor nation and just such happy people who had nothing. Children, very quick to smile, very interactive with us, and yet we could see they had no toys to play with. They had rocks and sticks to play with, and they made the most of that. We brought a Frisbee, and they thought they had won the lottery because we had a $5 Frisbee or a $10 Frisbee to play with. And unfortunately, this is true, that the more you have many times, the more ungrateful you become. And the better God was with Israel, the more Israel turned away from God, the more Jeshurun grew fat and kicked, as it says in verse 15. You may wonder at the name Jeshurun. It means upright one. And here it's used ironically, because where Israel should have been upright, he wasn't upright. He became fat and stout and sleek and forsook his God, scoffing at the very rock of his salvation. And it's sobering to think about just what spoiled brats we have become as Americans, and what spoiled brats are coming in the end times. People who have been given so much, who have received so much, and have become more and more ungrateful the more they have received. This is Paul's description in 2 Timothy 2. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be, get this, lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, which is what we've been talking about especially, unholy, heartless, wow, unappeasable, means they can't be satisfied. There's nothing you can do to appease them. Slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, betraying each other, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. The more they receive, the more ungrateful they become. All right, our fourth set. So we have this wet versus dry, this heavenly rain coming down on a very parched land, which is us, that needs it. We have God's goodness, and then our evil response, his generosity, and our ungrateful response. And so now we have this interesting set. We have a nation, the children of Israel, a nation chasing gods, small g. And God then, in response, capital G, the one true God, chasing nations. Now, if you recall back in verses 7 and 8, or verses 8 and 9, when the Most High had made all these peoples and he had allotted these lands to certain peoples and so forth, what was his special portion? What was his allotted heritage but Israel? So out of all the nations, he picks the chosen people to be his special people. And what do? They chase other gods, as we shall see here in the next verses. Start with verse 16. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. The Lord saw it and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. So there's a real irony here that if you're going to have the pendulum over here, one nation chasing all these gods, then God says, okay, the counterpoint to that is one God chasing all these nations. And this is good news for us. Paul understood this text, and he quotes it in Romans 10. But I ask you, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation I will make you angry. Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. Because see, in Israel, chasing other gods, they, and even rejecting their own Messiah in the person of Jesus Christ, this gave God, in a sense, the opportunity then to bring salvation to the Gentiles, to the nations, and that's who we are. In the next chapter, after Romans 10 that I just quoted, Romans 11, Paul will use an example of a cultivated olive, but because of their unbelief, God is chopping off that olive tree, and he's bringing in a wild olive, and he's grafting that in, and that wild olive is you and me, who have believed in the God of Israel. And everything that the patriarchs were all about that this nation later rejected, we have received. And we spiritually then have become sons of Abraham, who where sons are reckoned according to the faith and not biologically. And so this fourth point, this fourth set of thesis, antithesis is really good news for us because it spells our salvation. All right, in fifth place then, we have the kindness of God replaced by the anger of God. So kindness versus anger. So earlier in this song, we're seeing God providing for Israel in beautiful ways, getting honey out of the rock, and he's giving him curds and milk and the fat of the lambs and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's not how God feels anymore. We're going to see his kindness replaced by anger. And here's what it says. For a fire, verse 22, is kindled by my anger, and it burns in the depths of Sheol, devours the earth and its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. And I will heap disasters upon them. I will spend my arrows on them. They shall be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence. I will send the teeth of beasts against them, with the venom of things that crawl in the dust. Outdoors the sword shall bereave, and indoors terror, for young man and woman alike, the nursing child with the man of gray hairs. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will wipe them from human memory, had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord who did all this. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there's no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end. How could one have chased 1,000 and two have put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had given them up? For their rock is not our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. For their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of asps. Is it not laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasures? And so we see this long litany of curses rain down on this disobedient people. God is not happy. And they're going to be wasted by hunger, devoured by plague and pestilence, by war, and scattered to the four winds. And God says, I would have even dealt with them worse, except I didn't want their enemies to mock them. In times past, passages like this would be preached by fire and brimstone preachers with all that vitriol and the rough language, and God's ire was clearly visible in the preacher as he preached fire and brimstone. Nowadays, that's not very popular. People preach a loving God and a soft God and a gracious, perhaps even overly gracious, overindulgent God, and trying to please the people and make them feel good. By the time they leave church, they will just feel so great. Well, which is the right way then? Well, in my opinion, a good preacher preaches the text the way it's written. And I'm not talking just about the content, but also about the tone of voice. And we would be foolish to come away from this text and say, oh, the love of God and how, oh, he's so merciful and stuff. There comes a point where God's wrath is coming. And we understand as Christians that that's why we're taking shelter in Jesus. That the wrath of God is being poured out, but Jesus has taken that wrath, and God poured out his wrath on him, and that's where propitiation was found, where satisfaction was found in Jesus being that perfect lamb, so that we who hide behind Jesus then are shielded by him from the wrath of God. But that's not the case in these people who are turning away from God and who are rejecting his son and turning to false idols. So again, as readers of the word, as Christians, as preachers and teachers of the word, we need to preserve the scriptures as written and preserve even the tone of voice, the tenor of these passages as written. Well, there's a sixth set here, and that is vengeance then is replaced with vindication. So we're getting close then to how all of this tension is going to be resolved. This vengeance is coupled with God's anger. God's anger is first directed against Israel, and that's what we mean by the word vengeance. But then, once Israel has been absolutely gotten rid of its pride and come back in repentance, looking to God, then God sets about vindicating Israel and exacting vengeance on Israel's enemy. This is very similar to the message of the book of Habakkuk. Let's see how it's explained here in the Song of Moses. Starting in verse 35. Vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand and their doom comes swiftly. For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining bond or free. Then he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise and help you. Let them be your protection. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and will repay those who hate me, whether they're Israel or whether they're the enemies of Israel. And I will make my arrows drunk with blood, verse 42, and my sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired heads of the enemy. So again, God's vengeance is first directed against Israel because Israel's become an enemy of God. But then God's vengeance is directed against Israel's enemies once he's bent on vindicating his people. And this is what we seek as Christians too, that God would vindicate us, that in the end he would justify us and lift our head and embrace us and acknowledge that we belong to him and that we have believed in him and been on his side. And so there's all kinds of tension here that's being built up. How will this be resolved then? What's the synthesis coming out of this thesis and antithesis, all these theses and antitheses? Well, we find it in verse 43, the grand synthesis in verse 43. Grand synthesis. The climax, if you will, the statement that resolves everything. God triumphs, doesn't he? In verse 43, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods. He's conquered these gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. So we see finally God is at rest, and man is at rest in God, because they have survived all these different traumas and all these different stages. So synthesis in these cases, however, is not some kind of midpoint between wet and dry, good and evil. In each and every case, the way the tension is resolved is it needs to go God's way. So it needs to go on the wet side, not the dry side, the good side, not the evil side, the generous side, not the ingracious side, and so on. And let me spell that out just a little bit. So God has blessed us and not withheld his blessing. Now everything is just right. The knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. He has rained his wisdom and his love and his life-giving water upon mankind. And now finally we're in a position to receive it. And then again, his divine goodness has prevailed over human evil. What we see in verse 43 is that God does win. His love prevails over evil. Jesus defeats Satan. God overcomes sin and death through the person of Jesus. We see that his gratitude, his generosity is now met with gratitude, and we rejoice with him and we bow down to him. Now we're no longer ungrateful, but have become grateful as it should be. And it's interesting how this set of thesis, antithesis is resolved. It's resolved in the one body in Christ. Now there's no Jew nor Gentile. In Christ, Jew is joined to Gentile in the service of the one true God. Recall the words of Paul. He says, in Christ there's no Jew, nor Greek, nor male, nor female, nor slave, nor free. It's all been reconciled in Christ, and he has made one body without division out of all the peoples of the world. And we see that God's kindness then overcomes his anger. There's a lot of anger in the Bible, and it's righteous anger. It's righteous indignation. It's God upset with sin. It's God being upset with rebellion. But God's kindness does eventually triumph. His goodness prevails. And we see that vengeance is finally swallowed up in vindication. Paul sums it up in this way, talking about all this thesis, antithesis, and all the conflict of human history. He says this, then the end will come. Here's the grand synthesis of everything, the grand resolution of all the conflict of human history. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he is destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. I'm in 1 Corinthians 15:24. Verse 25. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. For God has put everything under his feet. There it is. That's the grand resolution, the grand synthesis. God wins in the end. And then back in our text, we just have the closing here. It says, Moses came and recited all the words of the song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua the son of Nun. And when Moses had finished speaking all these words to all Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words by which I am warning you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful, and here's where obedience plays in, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, but your very life. And by this word you shall live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. So, brother and sister, we shouldn't be like the dry, the evil, the ingratitude, the idolatrous side, the side that's causing God to be angry and to seek vengeance against us. We need to be that obedient child from the very beginning that doesn't need the discipline because we're already obeying. We're already believing in God. We're already rejoicing in our wonderful relationship of obedience to a good God who loves us.